City Matters.
Hello. Welcome to HMTV. I'm your host, Bernie Furshpan of Raised by Survivors. I've been talking to second-generation Holocaust survivors. Today I have a very special guest. He's a medical doctor here on Long Island. His father was a medical doctor in Germany, working in a hospital outside of a displaced persons camp. We're going to find out what that was like for him and what it was like for my guest, Burt Rochelson, Dr. Burt Rochelson. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I appreciate your participation here at the museum. It's an incredible educational facility, and I want to get this story out that you have. It's an incredible story about your dad. Your father was a medical doctor, and he graduated, I believe, in 1939.
He graduated in 1939 from a medical school in Kovno, Lithuania. Kovno was the name that the Jews referred to the town as. Non-Jews referred to it as Kaunas. And the medical school was University of Vytautas the Great. And he graduated in 1939.
What was your father's name?
Eli Gersian Rochelson.
And he was a practicing physician, or at least at that time in 1939, that was the year that Hitler and his Nazi party was put into the parliament. That's when he became Chancellor of Germany.
Correct, right.
Did your father tell you their concerns at that time?
So it was very interesting because Lithuania at times was under Lithuanian government, at times it was under the Russian government. And he describes his childhood as having very little anti-Semitism until the 1930s when the Nazis were gaining power in Germany. And so it was very tough for Jewish. Matter of fact, my father started in the veterinary school because they didn't allow Jews to go into the medical school in
Is that right?
Kovno. So he transferred from the veterinary school to the medical school. And there was a lot of discrimination in the medical school, especially because the exams were oral. And a lot of the professors were anti-Semitic, and they would fail the Jews, and the Jews would have to keep coming back and back until...
Horrible.
Yeah, it was horrible. But my father, as he would use the word, was stubborn, and he graduated in 1939, as you said, when things were really getting bad in Germany.
Eventually, your father was arrested and imprisoned in Dachau concentration camp. What year was that?
Well, that was 1944, but before that, in 1941, the Germans had taken over Kovno, Lithuania.
Right. That's what I was going to ask you next. So in 44, he was arrested, but before that, for 3 years, was he practicing, or what was he doing during the 3 years?
Well, he was
of occupation, of Nazi occupation.
Well, it's really fascinating because doctors, not uncommonly, would practice as physicians, even in the ghetto. And so he worked in the ghetto hospital caring for Jews. And in fact, shortly after the Germans occupied Kovno, they put all the Jews in the ghetto. And there was a ghetto hospital which the Germans burned to the ground with the doctors, nurses, and patients in the hospital.
Oh, that's awful.
And my father, fortunately, was not on.
That's awful.
But can I tell you a little story about
Yes,
this,
please.
which is relevant? So on the day in 1941 that the Germans were taking, remember, there was no internet, there was barely any radio information, so it was all word of mouth. And the Lithuanian Jews in Kovno heard that the Germans were invading, and they were all desperately trying to get out. And my father had a wife and a son, who at that time was 7 years old. And they were going to go to Russia because she was of Russian origin. And so they went to the train station in Kovno to go to Russia. And they got there, and his wife said, "Oh my God, I forgot my silk stockings. I have to go back and get my silk stockings." And my father said, "What are you, crazy? got to get out of here. And she
Right.
said, it's the only thing I have of any value. Please let me take it with me. And so she said, there'll be other trains. So they went back to their apartment in the town, and that turned out that was the last train out of Kovno. And they went back, and there were no more trains to go to Russia. And my whole upbringing, the phrase silk stockings had a great deal of meaning to me and my sister, because to my father, it was one little unexpected thing can change your whole life.
Amazing.
Forever.
Yeah, one thing.
But the lesson of silk stockings, you could take it different ways, does that mean that you have to look at everything really carefully because it might change your life?
Mm-hmm.
Or is the lesson that anything can change your life, and there's no point in trying to worry about every little decision that you make?
So really, philosophically, there are an infinite amount of potential events going on every second. And so,
that's right.
What direction you move, it's 1 degree to the right, 2 degrees to the left, will change the trajectory of your life.
That's right.
You bump into somebody in a supermarket, you end up marrying that person, you have a baby, and that baby becomes the president of the United States only because you bumped into a person in a supermarket.
Well, there's a lot of randomness in life.
That's what's so interesting about the universe, right? There's all this randomness.
Well, it's certainly true when we talk about survivors,
right?
Right?
It's so true.
Because there was a lot of randomness in
and a lot of luck involved.
Yeah.
But there's some things that are intentional, as we know, right? It's not random at all. There's some things that are planned, intentional, and evil behind it. So let's continue the story.
So my father was a physician in Kovno, in the Kovno ghetto hospital, and he was providing medical care with other Jewish nurses and Jewish doctors to the patients. And it obviously was very challenging because they didn't have the equipment, they didn't have the medications, they didn't have the support, they didn't have food, they didn't have money. But they did the best that they could under those circumstances to provide care to these patients. Mm-hmm. The other thing that happened, which is interesting, is that my father developed a camaraderie with the other Jewish physicians in Kovno, Lithuania, which they maintained until the day they died. They were friends when they came to the United States, and that bond really lasted forever.
And the children of those doctors, yourself included, have you maintained friendship?
Well, it's very interesting because I didn't know really any of them until I stumbled across I made a plan years ago because, as you mentioned, I'm a physician also. And I invited myself to give a lecture, to give grand rounds at the medical school from which my father graduated. And so I emailed the chair of the Department of Obstetrics at what's now University of Medicine in Kaunas. She probably thought I was crazy, and I invited myself to give grand rounds. And she said, sure, why not? And to me, it was a little bit of a victory tour because here I was, the son of my father who was imprisoned and sent to Dachau, and there I was giving grand rounds. And purely by coincidence, I stumbled across a symposium for a hospital that was based at a monastery outside of Munich called the St. Ottilian Monastery, just by pure coincidence, or maybe not, depending on your level of faith. That was a symposium to talk about the hospital for displaced persons in 1945. Mm-hmm. And there I met 4 sons of other doctors, all of whom, by the way, were doctors. Mm-hmm. And that was the first time that I had met them. And we participated in the conference, and we communicate.
How interesting. They're still there in that area.
Who is still there?
The sons.
Oh, no. One is in Toronto, one is in...
Oh, I see. So this is a conference. Basically, everybody converged. And then you met these people, and you had no idea that they existed even.
I knew their fathers' names because they were famous. But I never knew...
And you shared stories?
Oh, yeah, we shared. They did a interview with the 4 of us about what it was like. And we're all doctors.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. So you were all influenced pretty significantly by your parents. You know?
Oh, there's no question that happened. I mean, my father, to a large degree, felt that medicine saved his life. Right. But he meant it in 2 ways. because some of the Lagerführers treated doctors differently. In fact, my father related the story that at one point they all got beaten. And at one point he's getting beaten with a baton in the concentration camp, and the Lagerführer comes up to the German soldier and says, "What are you doing? Don't you know he's a doctor?" And working, even in the concentration camp, they had medical facilities, and my father worked there, and so they were able to get some of the primitive vaccines that they had against typhus and so on at that time. But that wasn't the real way my father, medicine saved my father's. The real way medicine saved my father's life is because when he came to the United States, his wife had been killed, his 10-year-old son had been killed, and the only thing he had left, he certainly had no money or anything, the only thing he had left was that he knew how to practice medicine. So I think when my father said it saved his life, that's really what he meant.
Yes, it was resourceful. He had some value to the Nazis, obviously.
Well, but that was the remarkable thing about my own personal interest in the era around the Holocaust is really more about the displaced persons camp.
Right, we're going to get to that, absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to learn more about it. Very interesting stories. My father was in a displaced persons camp in Munich at the Farnwald
Of course.
DP camp.
Also had a hospital there.
They had a hospital there too. So I want to learn more about your father's participation and experience there. But before, I want to ask you, did he ever explain to you how he was arrested and sent to Dachau?
Well, first he was arrested and sent to the ghetto.
To the ghetto.
And he lived in the ghetto.
Oh, okay. So from the ghetto, I guess they deported.
Yeah. So then they rounded them up, and they frequently gave them a choice. Do you want to go on a train somewhere for work, usually they said, or do you want to stay here? And the Jews had a guess which was better, to be on a train.
Lesser of the two evils.
Yeah, but they didn't even know what they were choosing.
Right,
it was getting a train to points unknown or stay there for events unknown.
Right.
So they had it's like if you choose what's behind that door, having no idea what's behind that door. And so they all were put in a train. They didn't know where they were going. And they had their son, and he and his wife said, should the boy go with you or should the boy go with you? Because they were separated to different camps.
Right.
And so his wife was sent to Stutthof, and they thought that the boy was going to go to Dachau with my father, but as soon as they got to Dachau, they took him to Auschwitz, and my father never saw him again. But as you mentioned, how it impacted me, so I was about 12 years old, maybe just before my bar mitzvah, and I'm going through a photo album like that, and I'm going through the pictures. And in one of the plastic sleeves behind a picture, there's another picture, and I pull it out, and it's a young boy. And I said, who is this? And they said, oh, my mother was, he said, we have to talk to you. And she calls my father. And that was when I learned that I even had a half-brother. I always talked about his brother.
Right.
And his name was Burtzik.
Oh, Boris, right?
Yeah. Well, Boris was on the birth certificate, but they called him Burtzik. And so I was named after him. And I always thought I was named after my father's father. But I was named after my brother, who I never knew I had until that moment when I took the picture out of the sleeve, and that's when I found out.
Wow. That must have moved you.
Yeah, well, you know, it's like that old Sondheim song, Life is Made of Moments. Every now and then a good one, but they're not all good. And so, that was one of those moments that you never forget. And then what happened was, so Burtzik was taken to Auschwitz, and just before the end of the war, he got the measles. And at the first dot, the Nazis would kill a kid that had the measles. And so he was eliminated, killed when he got the first. That's why a few years ago when there was a whole protest about the measles vaccine. I couldn't believe it, because if the measles vaccine had existed, he might have survived the other 3 months that would have been necessary. And my father only found out.
It's a different point of view, obviously, different perspective. To someone, it's good. To somebody else, it's bad. So, but let's talk about the DP camp. I'm very curious about that. They had in the DP camp where your father worked, they had the hospital there.
Yeah,
but they had other things. Go ahead.
But let me tell you how he got there first.
Sure.
So April, in the early spring of 1945, it was clear the Germans were losing the war, and they were scurrying to change the optics of the concentration camp. So they were trying to send them anywhere, and most likely to execution. So April 27th, my father gets put on a train out of Dachau. Again, he had no idea where he was going. And the Americans bombed the train because they thought there were munitions in the train. But there weren't. There were lots of Jews. And many Jews were killed when the Americans bombed the train, but a number, including my father, it's famous, it was at Schwabhausen, was the name of the town outside of Landsberg. And my father and a few of his buddies were out there in the woods where the train was derailed, and they hid in the woods in a church for a few days until somebody told them that the war was over and the Americans were in the towns. And then the story is amazing, and this is relevant to the hospitals. There was no plan for the survivors. There was no real organization about how to deal with the displaced persons. And Grimberg, who was also another Lithuanian doctor who started a hospital in the monastery at St. Ottilian, described hundreds of survivors just wandering the highways in Germany, not knowing where to go, and they're wearing the striped pajamas, and they just wrap rags around their feet, and they had no food, and then, it was just an unbelievable, horrible situation. And so Grimberg stumbles across, and they walked miles every day. Can you imagine? They'd been in a concentration camp for years. They weighed 90 pounds. They had no food, and they were walking miles a day. That's how determined they were. And so they stumble across a monastery in St. Ottilian outside of Landsberg am Lech in Germany. And it used to be a hospital for German soldiers who were injured during the war, but there were 4 unoccupied buildings. And Grimberg goes to the U.S. and the German administrators. Don't forget, there were German administrators too, because they needed Germans to help. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism, and they wanted no part of him. But Grimberg finds an American soldier, a non-Jewish soldier named Otto Raymond. And he goes to him and he says, "What can we do? I need a place for all these prisoners." And what happens is Grimberg gets artificial identification papers, and he gets civilian clothes because all he had was a striped uniform. And he was fluent in English, and he masquerades as a representative of the International Red Cross. And he goes and he meets the German commandant and the American military administration. And he says, "You guys, you have to make those buildings available to all of these patient survivors, former prisoners, or we're going to come, the International Red Cross is going to come down hard on you." And the German commandant says, okay, you could have the 4 buildings. And so it was subterfuge.
Amazing.
And Grimberg starts the hospital in St. Ottilian, and within a few months, they have 750 patients.
And this commandant didn't even question him or look for any papers, or didn't he?
Well, he had phony
He had phony papers. I see. So they used 4 buildings, all 4 buildings?
Yes,
yeah.
but I never knew St. Ottilian even existed until I went to that symposium, right? My father always talked about the hospital in Landsberg am Lech, which was this really beautiful town. It looks like it would be in a Disney World impression of what a German town looks like.
Like a Bavarian
Yes,
village.
Beautiful. I've been there several times already. And so they're only 18 miles apart, St. Ottilian and Landsberg am Lech. So my father wanders in a different direction and starts a hospital with one of his colleagues named Shlomo Nabrisky. And Nabrisky runs an inpatient. My father runs the outpatient facility. Liberation, and you're in medicine, so you know, Liberation was April 29th. By May 9th, 1945, they had a hospital up and running in Landsberg am Lech. 10 days later. If I ordered Q-tips at my hospital, I wouldn't get them in 10 days. And they had a hospital up and running by May 9th. And you can imagine how hard it was to run a hospital, and also how hard it was for the patients. All of them were sick. Every single one of the survivors was a patient in one way or another.
Of course.
And how did they get the equipment? They took it from the Germans. There weren't a lot of questions. They took the medication, they took the equipment, they took everything. And
that's pretty incredible. Pretty incredible story. And so he ran this hospital for at least a year? Was it between 45 and 46?
Well, the Landsberg am Lech displaced persons camp lasted until 1951.
Oh, till 51.
Yeah, okay. Because the displaced persons had no place to go.
Right.
Some of them, if they went back to their homes, were murdered by the locals when they got there. A lot of them didn't speak any other language, and so they were lost. But my father got there in April of 1945, and he came to the States in June of 1946. So it was about 10 months.
Right. And he had quite an impact on, establishing a facility there to help the DP.
I want to address that because it's a very important point. He had an impact in the overall general sense of establishing a hospital and medical care. But more than anything, he had an impact on individuals. And I'll tell you two stories if you have a minute. A few years ago, we stumbled on a fellow who lived in Brooklyn named Nissan Krakenowski. And he was an Orthodox Jewish man who at the time was probably 80 years old. And he was about 8 or 10 years old, maybe a little more. In the DP camp at Landsberg, my father took care of him, and he says to my sister and me, he said, "Your father saved my life." I said, "How did he save your life?" He said, "Well, my parents were killed, my whole family were killed, I had no hope." He says, "I couldn't eat, I really could barely walk." I said, "So how did my father save your life?" He said, he sat down with me and he held my hand and he said, "You're going to be all right." And so Nissan said, that was the first time that I believed that could be true.
Mm-hmm. He felt encouraged.
So he felt hope.
Yeah, hope, yeah.
And then my father, one of his first patients was a young woman named Masha who emigrated to Israel. And my father maintained a friendship with her and the family and her kids in Israel over the years. And I went to interview her a few years ago, which I'm so glad that I did. And she told me something very interesting about my father. She said, even when he smiled, he was sad. And I think that was true. And I think probably for a lot of us that are 2Gs know what she meant.
Totally related. Very relatable. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my father had a beautiful smile, but you can see the sadness in his eyes because he lost his mom, his dad, his brothers, his sister, all of them. They were all executed. We're almost out of time. I just want to point out just a couple of things before we go. First of all, you put together a beautiful presentation that I reviewed about your father's story, very detailed, and I learned a lot from it just by reading the material about the DP camps. And I know that they had occupational therapy. I know they had some rehab. I know they had some schooling and education, but I didn't realize they also had a theater company. They had an orchestra. They had, let's see here, besides the hospital, I wasn't thinking that there was a hospital. I thought maybe there's some medical doctors, maybe a small clinic, but they actually had a full-blown hospital. They had a newspaper. They had a school. and they had a synagogue, as well as occupational therapy. So that's quite extensive program to rehabilitate the Jewish community. My father told me that Jewish organizations from around the world descended on these camps to recruit young people to go to their communities, like from South America, from New York, from Israel. My father decided to go to Israel with a few friends because they were convinced that's where they should go.
Yeah.
But your father, what happened in 51, you said?
46.
46, yeah. He decided to go to...
I want to add one more thing
Yeah.
to that. First of all, the goal was for them to build a community that had everything.
Right.
But the phrase that they used was Sha'arit HaPlata, which means the surviving remnant. And one of the most amazing things relevant to the medicine at that time was it's unbelievable. The birth rate in the DP camp, the year from 1945 to 1946, was the highest in Europe compared to any others.
Amazing.
And when you think that the women could even still ovulate and have babies, and that there was any kind of relationships, but there was such a determination to start to rebuild the family that the birth rate was extraordinarily
That's
high.
an incredible thing. I've heard that before. I'm glad you confirmed it, and it makes a lot of sense. Well, Burt, thank you so much for joining me today on
Thank you
Raised
for
by
having me.
Survivors. Dr. Burt Rochelson. Did I say it correctly?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I appreciate all the people here that have been following HMTV. We have over 20 different hosts with a variety of topics. I enjoy doing my podcast, honestly. The people that I meet are so interesting and good people who are doing good things. And I appreciate all that you're doing and contributing to the education of what happened during the Holocaust, how people survived. Most people, we lived in a very spoiled society. We have no clue what it's like to survive when you have no choice. So I want to thank all of our audience members that have been listening in. Thank you so much for joining us today on Ordinary Heroes. I'm your host, Bernie Furshpan. Until next time.